Okay, so thank you, Sapna, for inviting me, and also TLC in general. As you heard, I'm a professor of English in the university here, and my talk today is about the new education policy to 2020 and decentering English in India. I need to say two things before I begin. One is that I have a vested interest in what I'm going to say. So I will be arguing for decentering English, but you have to judge how far the fact that I am a professor of English and I have taught English for many years. And indeed, I raised a family with the income from my job. So I do have a vested interest in that. But I will also be arguing at parts, I'll be arguing against a certain kind of attitude towards English. But you have to assess how far I'm being sincere or not. In other words, what I'm asking you to do is be a little critical, not accept everything that I say. And I look forward to the discussion at the end, because we need to have a discussion about English and what English is doing in higher education in India. Now, bear with me while I bring up my slides. You know that it takes a moment or two. So I'll be bringing up my slides now. Presentation. Okay, I think at this point you're seeing my screen, my slide. So this is a slide that you don't really need. It's not much information here for you. It seems that you are not seeing my slide. Okay, just a minute.
No, we can see. We can see.
Oh, you can see it.
We can see.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, all right. Okay. Incidentally, I had a look at the list of participants, and I've seen that there are people from all over the country, and there are, of course, a few people I know, some of my colleagues in the university, junior colleagues, and there are people from all over the country. So I am, in fact, privileged to be talking to you. Anyway, English in higher education in India. Now, you know that we have the new education policy, 2020. And over the years, there have been several attempts to reform education, including higher education in India, because of the realization that our higher education actually has roots in colonial education introduced by the British. but you know, the more things change, the more they seem to remain the same, because we had the English Education Act in 1835. And in fact, you can draw a straight line from that year, 1835, right up to today, 2021. Because one thing that hasn't changed is the use of English in higher education. The English Education Act introduced English in higher education in India. And that hasn't changed, despite all the changes that there have been. And the first universities in India, and much of this is actually common knowledge, many of you know this, began in Calcutta, Madras, and in Bombay in 1857. Now we are in post-colonial India, post-1947 India, and so that there is a legitimate concern, I think, whether English in post-1947 India is a continuance of colonial ideology and agenda. So that is something that should concern all of us, not just those of us who teach English, but all of us, because if you teach in an institute of higher education in India, whether it's a college or a university, your medium of instruction is actually English. Most universities and colleges, if not all, employ English in higher education. So then we have this very legitimate concern that are we continuing with a colonial ideology and program? So that is something that I would like to talk about. Now, in the new education policy, the 2020, primary goal is to provide access to socio-economically disadvantaged, by increasing the gross enrollment ratio in higher education to 50% by 2035. So this is a noble goal, and I think we are all committed to this. Education cannot be only for a few. It cannot be a privilege of the upper classes or the people who've had advantages. Education should actually be opened up for everybody, for people who have not traditionally been able to go to universities, and also to women. Women for a long time were denied education. So we want that we want to broaden our higher education. Now, if you go up to 50% by 2035, this will mean that there will be many first-generation students, especially in our public universities. So, first-generation students, the first students in the family to come to university, and many of these students will be coming from not so privileged backgrounds, and they may not have SS or the kind of proficiency that many of us now have acquired. All right, so my next slide. Again, from this, from the National Education Policy, there are many things, of course, but a couple of points that I want to highlight. I'm quoting, wherever possible, the media form of instruction until at least grade 5, but preferably till grade 8 and beyond, will be the home language, mother tongue, or local language. Thereafter, the home/local language shall continue to be taught as a language wherever possible by both public and private schools. So this is a recognition of the fact that children probably learn best when they're taught in a language that they're familiar with, be it the mother tongue or the home language, whatever that is. So this is a recognition of the multilingualism and the power of language. And as I said, there is an understanding that if someone is taught, if a child is taught in his home language, mother tongue, then he or she learns better. So the National Education Policy recognizes this. And we have to remember then that English may not be the best medium of instruction, given the fact that you learn best in a language that is your own. Now, why is English used in higher education? There is a background and there is a history. Again, I'm going over a history that you may be already familiar with. And if you're not familiar with this, then you should be. I think every educated Indian should know this, even if you belong to a discipline that is not, say, education itself or English or any of the language subjects. I think even if you teach a science subject or a management subject, you should actually know this history. In fact, anybody who is a modern Indian, I think, should know this history. Now, the Charter Act of 1813. In the Charter Act, one of the and this was when when India was ruled by the East India Company back in 1813. So there was a provision in the Charter Act that a lakh of rupees would be set aside to be annually applied to the revival and improvement of literature and for the introduction and promotion of knowledge of the sciences. So a lakh of rupees was set aside for these two purposes. What was not defined was that what literature and in what language. This was not mentioned in the particular act. And from this ambiguity, or the fact that this was not defined, from that arose what is known as the Anglicist and Orientalist controversy. There were people on both sides of this debate, Englishmen and Europeans, and also some educated Indians. Macaulay is a good example of the Anglicist school. These were people who believed that Indians, the natives, should be given Western education and should be taught in English. So there was this very strong school, if you like, of thinking. On the other side were the Orientalists. Orientalists have an example there, Wilson, Horace Heyman Wilson was an admirer of the Sanskrit, admirer of Sanskrit classics, and in fact he was the translator of Kalidas. He believed the opposite. He believed that Indians should be taught their own knowledge, and in languages that were traditionally used in Indian education, like Sanskrit, for instance, mainly Sanskrit. So this controversy went on for many, many years. It was not resolved until the year 1835. So it had it went on, as I said, for several decades. In between, you had Hindu College coming up in Calcutta. And Hindu College, the date is interesting, 1817. Hindu College came up as a result of local pressure. Right? So the Bengali Bhadralok, they wanted an institution, a college, to which they could send their children, their sons mainly, not daughters, but the sons. And they were the ones who said that we want Western knowledge. Hindu College was envisaged as an institution, as a hybrid institution. That means there would be some Indian teaching, of course, but then what these people who wanted the college, and as I said, many of them were Indians, they wanted an institution in which Western knowledge would be taught. Why? Because with the East India Company in place, there were a lot of jobs that were there for Indians too. And Indians had to sort of upskill, learn English and the associated knowledges so that they could take up these jobs. So this was not an empty demand, a demand for no reason. There was a very definite reason for this. And incidentally, many of us still continue to use English for job purposes. So it was in a way the beginning of that these parents of young native boys, Bengali boys, wanted a better future for their children, for their sons, and they thought that English was a very definite skill that was required in the job market. And there was a very great Indian, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who was very proficient in several languages. He knew Persian, he knew Sanskrit, and he learned English. And this very widely read man, a very knowledgeable man, in a famous petition, this is what he said: "We were filled with sanguine hopes that this sum referring to that 1 lakh rupees that was set aside for Indian education, would be laid out in employing European gentlemen of talents and education to instruct the natives of India in mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry, anatomy, and other useful sciences which the nations of Europe have carried to a degree of perfection that have raised them above the inhabitants of the other parts of the world." Now, it's been said that Raja Ram Mohan Roy was actually demanding English for patriotic reasons. He thought that Indians had been left behind because they didn't know English and they didn't know the Western sciences. And he demanded, in fact, that this should be given to Indians. English should be given to Indians, and also Western sciences and Western knowledge in general should be given to Indians so that Indians could compete with Europeans. So it was not for, he was not really your typical colonial. He didn't have this colonial mentality as we might think. But on the other hand, he had an idea that perhaps if this was given to Indians, Indians could equally compete with their European counterparts. And after that, we had the English Education Act. What I don't have on my slide is that William Bentinck, he decided to form a commission, a one-man commission, and he asked Lord Macaulay, the famous Lord Macaulay, Thomas Babington Macaulay, to study the situation and to give a report. And Macaulay, as I've already told you, was on the side of English. And he produced a notorious report in which he said several harsh things about Indian education and Indian knowledge. And he said, I'll come to that in my next slide. And largely because of his influence, or no, if not largely because of his influence, at least one very important factor for the English Education Act was that his report. And in 1835, you had the English Education Act, whereby English became the medium of instruction in institutions of higher education in India. And Lord Bentinck incidentally was the Governor General from 1828 to 1835, and he had already begun a process of employing Indians in the lower posts, not in the high posts, but in the lower posts. It made no sense to bring a clerk from England to India. So it was thought that it would be better to train Indians for the clerical kind of jobs, that kind of job, in India itself. So it made more economic sense. And I think Lord Macaulay, Bentinck already was sort of inclined to impose English on Indians when he asked Macaulay to write his report, when he gave him that responsibility of studying the situation and producing a report. Anyhow, let me move to my next slide. Now, Macaulay's minute, initially he had the report, a minute. This was in February 2nd, 1835. He talked of programming Indians to English education. And he had, as I've already told you, he had great contempt for Indian knowledge and culture. He didn't know Sanskrit or Arabic. But then that didn't stop him from saying that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. So he basically dismissed Indian knowledge, Indian literature, and he thought that European education was any day superior. So this is Macaulay, and these are very famous lines. You know, we love to hate Macaulay because of the terrible things that he said. And Macaulay also had something that is later on was described as the filtration theory. That is, what is it? Let's see here. He said he recognized that it was impossible to give millions of Indians English. So he thought that they could create a class of Indians who would be anglicized and who would know English. And this anglicized class of Indians would then go and do the remaining part of the job, which was to disperse this knowledge among the masses. So let me read from my slide. It is impossible for us, with a limited means, to attempt to educate the body of the people. We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. To that class, we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with the terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature, and to render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population. Now, this is actually quite a frightening, part of his report. I say frightening because he was so clear about programming Indians, that you create a class of Indians, and that class is a class to which you and I probably belong, and that we, the educated Indians, Indians educated in English, we are the ones who would go and then complete the remaining part of the colonizing process. Now, let me move on to the next slide. Now, Macaulay, the Indian Education Act was not the only act to deal with Indian education. Later on, you had Charles Wood's Dispatch, 1854, and it repeats some of the things that Macaulay said, but it also tries to sort of, mitigate some of the extremism that you find in Macaulay. I will read the highlighted portions. That universities were to be set up in Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. And these were the initial Indian universities. And the Indian university has not really changed very much since those days, structurally too.
People are waiting to join.
Okay. Just give me a minute. Yeah. All right. Because there was a realization that maybe Macaulay had been a bit too extreme, there was this, it was said, okay, that let's give Indians their training in their mother tongue also. However, this was only going to be at the primary level, as you can see below. I've highlighted that part. The medium of instruction at the primary level was to be vernacular, but in higher levels, it would be English. And this led to the setting up of the University of Calcutta, the University of Bombay, and the University of Madras in 1857. And then subsequently, you had the University of Punjab, 1882, and the University of Allahabad in 1880. 7. Now, of course, none of this has gone unchallenged. And in fact, Gandhi, great Indians have actually responded to this situation. This is a slide giving you some of those responses. Gandhi, for instance, in Hind Swaraj, a very, very radical text, where he was very critical of English. He said, to give millions a knowledge of English is to enslave them. The foundation that Macaulay laid of education has enslaved us. If this state of things continues for a long time, posterity will, it is my firm opinion, condemn and curse us. Is it not a painful thing that if I want to go to a court of justice, I must employ English as a medium, and that when I become a barrister, I may not speak my mother language, and that somebody else should have to translate it to me from my own language? Is this not absolutely absurd? Is this not a sign of slavery? Am I to blame the English for it or myself? And then he said, it is we, the English-knowing Indians, that have enslaved India. The curse of the nation will rest not upon the English, but upon us. So very, very clear about this. And this was written way back in 1909. And this is 2021. Bankim, the great Bengali writer, actually wrote in English. Bankim was one of the first students of Hindu College, and he wrote his first novel in English. But then, you know what happened subsequently? He rejected English and started writing in Bengali, Bangla. And he became a very successful novelist. Michael Madhusudan Dutt is another example of somebody who initially wrote in English, and then subsequently he wrote his poetry in Bangla. And not only in India, but in other colonial countries too. In other colonial countries, post-colonial now. In Kenya, for instance, there's a famous in the West was subsequently modified and changed by Gandhi for his own purposes. Now, there's a famous discussion of appropriation in the novel Kanthapura by Raja Rao. And telling has not been easy, he says, because he's writing in English. And he says that English is not really an alien language to us. We are all instinctively bilingual. Indeed, this is true. All of us can speak more than one language. In Europe, many European countries, they are monolingual. But you and I we don't stop to think about this, but all of us know 2-3 languages, and we move from language to language very easily. So we employ Hindi perhaps when we go to the market. With our parents, we speak in the mother tongue. Then when you meet a friend, you speak in English. So this happens in, all the time. You never stop to think about it. Now, we cannot write like the English. And he says we should not. We can only write as Indians. So there has to be an Indian way of writing English. My next slide. Now, the British Empire no longer exists, and Britain now is a second-rate country. But then something unexpected happened. With the end of the British Empire, it was natural to expect that English would wither away and lose its earlier status. But that didn't happen because something else happened. You had the rise of globalization and you had modern communications, whether it's the internet or other means of communications. All of this has led to a situation where English is now today probably more powerful than it was in the heyday of empire. So that has nothing to do with colonialism today, or very little to do with colonialism. Now the challenge for us is then, can we teach English in these circumstances, in these new circumstances, without reinforcing colonial and elitist values? And surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, the answer has come from the Dalits, very suppressed section of Indian society. The Dalits actually came up with the goddess of English. Now, let me read from a slide. The goddess of English, this is the idea of one of their activists, was depicted wearing a hat and standing atop a computer. In her right hand, she held a pen, and in her left, the Constitution of India. She was the brainchild of Chandrabhan Prasad, a Dalit activist and writer. And interviewed in 2010, he explained the symbolism of the goddess, modeled on the Statue of Liberty, and why a temple was being built for her in Bankagaon in UP. Dalits, he said, would use English to rise up the ladder and become forever free. So this was a demand on the part of the Dalits that give us English. And in a way, it's not very different from that demand that was made by Raja Ram Mohan Roy many, many years ago, that give us English, because that is almost a kind of technology that allows us to sort of rise up and become free, or at least be able to compete with others. Now, when we decide that we should not use English, or English is colonial, then in a sense, that is the paternal approach in which you and I decide, we are the more privileged people, we decide that, okay, English has a colonial background, it is a perpetuation of the colonial ideology, so let's not give English to others. But that's you and I deciding. So we, the privileged, decide what is good for those who are not so lucky. And our universities are changing. As I said before, and as the new education policy, national education policy says, we should now try to expand our universities. They are no longer places for the elite. And students now come from schools and colleges where English is not spoken with any competence. So perhaps our responsibility then is to teach English better. Now, this is one of the things that I would like to propose. I propose that we abandon our lingering colonial misgivings about English and look at it pragmatically, like previous generations of Indians had done, as a language of education and opportunity. Easier to learn now, and today it's probably easier to learn English because of the availability of educational videos on YouTube and various apps and aids like online dictionaries. And there's evidence that many, many Indians are actually trying to improve their English language skills by using books like Norman Lewis's Word Power Made Easy. This is a book that sells by the thousands every year. The English departments do not seem to know this book. And in fact, some of the greatest resistance to teaching English may come from English departments because of post-colonialism, the rise of post-colonialism. Other things, for instance, there is a decline in teaching skills perhaps now. Certain amount of snobbery, and also the English classroom is not the best place to, Indian classroom is not the best place to teach. Language teaching happens best when the numbers are small. But I myself have taught in a college many, many years ago, and I remember that in my classroom there would be anything like 100 to 150 students there. And we'd have a class, and then there'd be, for another week, there would be no classes. So, you met your students not very frequently. Language learning cannot happen in these circumstances. So these are some of the challenges of teaching English today, whether it's in a university or in a college. Incidentally, the fact that our language skills are poor has led to certain consequences in higher education. In 2018-19, it was estimated that India had 993 universities and 39,931 colleges, so about 40,000 institutions of higher education in India. And you know there's a lot of emphasis on research nowadays, and much of that research writing, in fact, I suppose all of it, almost all of it, happens in English. And what has happened consequently? Well, we find that now, there was an article in Nature by the vice chairman of GC, where he noted that more than 1/3 of the papers that came out of India in 2015 are in predatory journals. And therefore, UGC has now this consortium for academic research and ethics, etc. So one of the problems with the writing a research paper in English is the uncertain, the researcher's uncertain knowledge of English. And so, particularly in humanities and social sciences, where there's a certain amount of descriptive writing, this is what happens. Students with poor language skills fall back on copy-paste, and they lift entire passages and just changing a word here and there. And this is serious plagiarism. And UGC now has made it mandatory to have a paper on academic integrity. And part of that paper is also about these things, sensitizing students about this problem of not copying the language. I'm not talking about the data part. And there's a general recognition in our culture, in our popular culture, that English is not an easy language to master in many ways. Amitabh Bachchan has this immortal line, English is a very funny language, he says in the film that some of you may have seen. And recent films, English to English, and a much earlier film, Chupke Chupke, these are films where you have this reflection that English is not an easy language to learn. And many Indians grapple with English. I have a slide on Northeast Assam because in case you want to know how old is the history of English in India. As far back as 1869, there is a letter by a missionary entitled "What is to be the Language of Assam?" And this letter shows you that already in the mid-19th century, English had become a language of aspiration. In Bengal, the setting up of Hindu College in 1817 shows that by that time, English had become a language of aspiration, 1817. In Assam, maybe about 50, 60 years later on, this happens. Generally speaking, I think English language skills in the Northeast region are better than some parts of India. At least there's no hostility to the language. In parts of India, there is a hostility to the language because of its connection to privilege. But then the Northeast, of course, is a very heterogeneous region, so I suppose this kind of generalizations also is to be, cannot be accepted generally. Now, as I said, I'm more interested in the discussion or questions that you might have to, that may be occurring to you. So this is almost my last slide. This sort of sums up my attitude. As I told you, I teach English. And I have to make peace with myself. Why do I teach English? Why do I continue to teach English? And this is what this is the conclusion I have come to in my own life. Thanks to the example of the Dalits and that of generations of Indians in the past who learned the English language for career reasons, no more and no less, I have reached a more hopeful and pragmatic phase about the place and role of English in our higher education institutions and universities. Okay, so thank you. That's my slide. That's the end of my slide presentation. And now I'll be happy to take any questions. And as I said, I'm not really interested in so much. I mean, it's okay if you agree with me, but I'll be more happy to listen to, or at least more stimulated to listen to any dissenting comments that you have.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
I am Dr. Dibakar Maut, Department of English, Pandit Dindal Upadhyaya Mahavidyalaya, Bongaigaon.
Okay.
So it's a very enriching session, and also it reflects the dilemma that we have when we try to teach English, especially I'm working in a college. So, sir, can you suggest something very specific to proceed? So, because nowadays we are also having the problem of this medium and also the new policy, and in political scenario we are having that this English as a medium is to be very marginalized. So please give some suggestion in this regard, sir. Thank you, sir.
About teaching English efficiently, is that what
yes,
you're talking
sir.
about?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Actually, you know, my feeling is that by the time a student comes to college, it's already a bit late. In the sense that this education, college is not a place to learn English, right? I mean, and that should have been learned earlier. But then the teaching in the schools, and again, the Indian school is a very diverse phenomenon. Because there are good schools meaning at least where the English is proficiently taught, and there are schools where it's not taught well. So it's not the student's fault, or many times it's not the student's fault that he or she has not acquired the necessary skills. But then when the student comes to college, I think it's a very real disadvantage. When you know someone who has poor skills, it has to compete alongside somebody else whose skills are better. It's not a fair situation at all. And that's where that moral responsibility that, I think is what you're talking about comes in. Again, I don't know what your experience is, but as I said, I have taught in a college. My problem was that the classes were very, very big. In summer, the ceiling fans are on, so they can't even hear you at the back. And then teaching actually needs individual attention. See, what happens is the teacher performs, right? You teach the text, and you've really worked hard, and you're breaking down the text to your students and trying to make it understandable. You do everything. But then what happens is that you are the one who's performing. The student is not performing. He's just a passive listener. And aspects like speaking, aspects like writing, these are never simply don't have the time in the typical Indian college or classroom. There's no time for any of that. So I really don't know. It's really a very bad situation. And the individual teacher, I suppose, you have to break up the class into smaller groups. But then where's the time for that? And then what happens is, if the student, many of our students are also from science backgrounds, like their main subject might be science. Science departments will not release their students for this kind of extra work. In my university, I've tried it. We've also, some of my colleagues, we have also said that, okay, told the students come in the evening. But then they come for a few days, and then they stop coming because they say that they have the practicals and there are other priorities. So everybody understands the importance of English. Especially in terms of social mobility, because education is a form of social mobility, is it not? Right? But then people understand this, but then no one creates a situation. I mean, it's very difficult to create a situation which is conducive to the teaching of English. So it's not easy at all. I really don't have any very satisfactory answers for you, really.
Thank you, sir.
Good morning, sir.
Morning.
This is Dr. Kakulide from Galgotia College of Engineering. So thank you so much for a very opening the start of the English in India and also. But I do have some questions that where is the problem? So I think one is this mother tongue influence, that during the formative years, the children generally spend a considerable time of the day with their family members who might not use English at all.
Yes.
This is one of the problem. And the second problem is that introducing English in vernacular medium schools. Like in the vernacular schools across India, English is introduced at the level of 5 or 6 or as L2 or L3. So once that critical age, that is 0 to 8 years, has been crossed, it becomes difficult to learn language and attain the competence. So students coming from such schools have a hard time coping with students from English medium schools in higher education. The second problem is that English language educators. So most of the schools adopt English via grammar translation method. So even though the passage or a sentence is read in English, explanation is in the regional language. So this is what I felt, during my college days also, when I did a part of my education in Assam. English literature was explained in Bengali. So this is one. Another fourth point is that focusing more on grammar rather than the application. So English classes in most schools or coaching centers focus and give importance in the theoretical aspect of the language rather than application. So again, I'm sorry to take a lot of time. Another question is, another problem, in fact, is which English the language educators are focusing. So since there are multiple varieties of English spoken worldwide, the question remains, how conversant and aware are our language educators? Then exposure to English language and culture. That is also one of the things that many of us English literature we pick up, but then we hardly know the English culture, how the language behaves. In order to get to the essence of the language, one must know the culture. So it is inherent in the language. For example, idioms, phrases are so culture specific. So translation method does not help to achieve that clarity and understanding. So, and then the problem is that language learning is a mechanical process. So it is not. But if you look at the first language we learn at home, so that is not a mechanical process. Neither of our parents run around with us with a dictionary or a grammar book. But by the age of 3,